With you this morning about racial justice. Long a concern for many people and ignored or minimized by many others, racial justice has now been lifted up by our president and many others as a problem we must admit and confront for our country. The death of George Floyd on May 25 last year was seen by millions on live TV, and of course it's been rerun many times since then. It sears into our consciousness the reality of racism in our country. Some people have interpreted it simply as a problem with the police, but it's far deeper than that. It involves all of us. The reality is that we live in a racist country, a racist society, a racist culture. We are not alone in this. Racism is rampant throughout the world, but we must concern ourselves with it here, in our own homeland. Now you might be thinking to yourself, well, I'm not a racist, and that is no doubt true. I doubt if there are any overt racists within the sound of my voice this morning, but that is not the problem. The problem is that racism is the environment in which we live. We don't stop to think about it very often. We don't even realize we are living in a racist culture. Just like a fish doesn't realize it is swimming in water. That's just where the fish is, in the water. That's just where we are, in a racist society and culture and country. If we look for it, the evidence is all around us. In Washington, D.C., where I live, the population is just about evenly split between black and white residents. Recent Census Bureau figures report about 47% black and 45% white, with other racial groups making up the remaining balance. But here's a small example. Guess who gets more traffic tickets? The Washington Post reported recently on a study they made of the period between 2016 and 2020. In that 5-year period, $96 million in traffic tickets were issued in white neighborhoods, while $467 million in traffic tickets were issued in black neighborhoods. That's almost 5 times as much. Where's the justice in that? In this instance, you could say again, well, that's just a problem with the police. They're the ones who issue the tickets. But here's another example that doesn't involve the police at all. A recent report showed that the district's teacher evaluation system, which is named Impact, is racially biased. Here's a quote from a report in the Washington Post, and I'm reading it now. In the 2018-19 academic year, black teachers, who account for 54% of the teacher workforce, on average received an impact score that was 17 points lower than their white colleagues. Impact is based on a 400-point scale. Hispanic teachers scored 9 points lower than white teachers. So there we have evidence to be found of racial injustice in many areas of our society, not just the police. Here's another example. Maybe you heard a recent story on NPR reporting on library cataloging systems. It found that both the Dewey Decimal System and the Library of Congress system have categories for black studies, but neither has a category for white studies. Black studies, of course, has been recognized for a generation or so as a legitimate academic area of study. What would white studies be? White studies would be everything else. The history of our country, which we teach our children in school, has largely been a history of white people, indeed, mostly white men. It's the standard of the way we think. Why would we think any other way? It's the water the fish are swimming in. Why would they even think about it? This brings us to the perilous place of critical race theory, or CRT. Critical race theory has gotten a lot of negative attention recently, with normally boring school board meetings turning into shouting matches and even fights. What is it anyway? Critical race theory is the view that race, instead of being biologically grounded and naturally, is socially constructed, and that race, as a socially constructed concept, functions as a means to maintain the interest of the white population that constructed it. Critical race theory holds that the law and legal institutions in the United States are inherently racist insofar as they function to create and maintain social, economic, and political inequalities between whites and non-whites, especially African Americans. Critical race theory was first articulated by a group of scholars which included Derek Bell of Harvard, starting in about 1989. It happens that Derek Bell was my next-door neighbor when I was in seminary at Harvard in the early 1990s. I didn't know him very well, but I knew he was doing important work. He died in 2010. I wonder what his response would be to the brouhaha surrounding critical race theory today. I want to turn now to a very important book which came out about 2 years ago and was on the New York Times bestseller list for quite a while. It's called How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. You'll be amused to hear an experience that I had with this book. I was having lunch at the Country Cafe Pit Stop in Sperryville, reading the book as I sat at one of the picnic tables. I was reading it very carefully, and I was underlining and making notes in the margin. Another customer who was dining at the pit stop saw me with the book, but he didn't get a clear look at the title. Let me show it to you again. And so, as I got up to leave, he said to me, "Excuse me, are you studying to be an anarchist?" All I could say was, "No, I'm just reading about it." Kendi makes an important distinction between non-racist and anti-racist. All of us agree we're not racists. Kendi says this is not enough. We must be actively anti-racist if we are to move forward toward racial justice. Here's what he says about racist ideas and how they harm blacks and are seductive to whites. He writes this: "Even now, I wonder if it was my poor sense of myself that first generated my poor sense of my people. Or was it a poor sense of my people that inflamed a poor sense of myself? Like the famous question of the chicken and the egg, the answer is less important than the cycle it describes. Racist ideas make people of color think less of themselves, which makes them more vulnerable to racist ideas. Racist ideas make white people think more of themselves, which further attracts them to racist ideas." Kendi writes that we waste our time by thinking so much about different groups of people, specifically black and white. We would make more progress toward justice, he says, if we concentrated instead on power and policies. Who has the power to act? Who has the power to create policy and laws which will control others? If we looked at these questions, we might begin to make some progress toward real racial justice. That's the writing of Ibram Kendi in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. A giant of racial justice, LGBTQ justice, and progressive theology died this past week. Maybe you saw his obituary in the Washington Post. John Shelby Spong rose to be a bishop in the Episcopal Church, but a very controversial one. He was Bishop of Newark, New Jersey for about 20 years and wrote dozens of books urging the rethinking and revitalization of religion. Spong was born in 1931 in Charlotte, North Carolina, and died last week at the age of 90. I knew him slightly, and he had a very gentle sort of southern accent. In his autobiography, Here I Stand, he tells the story of an experience he had in about 3rd grade. Of course, the public schools were segregated at that time in North Carolina, so he went to the white elementary school, while black boys and girls went to the colored elementary school. At least someone was doing some progressive thinking and trying to nurture some communication between the two elementary schools at that time. So they decided they would have an exchange day, and an honor student from each school would visit the other school and spend the day there. John Spong was chosen to visit the black school and spend the day in 3rd grade. He said at first it seemed pretty much like his white elementary school. The walls were painted green, a dark shade at the bottom, lighter shade toward the top. There was a blackboard with chalk, and above it the portraits of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. The children all sat in individual desks that had inkwells that were no longer used. Everything was a little bit more beat up than at the white school, though. The desks were more banged up, and the textbooks were older and more dog-eared. Spong said the lessons were about the same as he had in White Elementary School, 3rd grade. Some arithmetic, some reading, going outside to play at recess, and so forth. As the day wore on, he was getting more comfortable. Then, as it was almost time to go home, the teacher announced, "Okay, boys and girls, we're going to end the day today by singing our national anthem." And Spong thought to himself, "Oh, I know that. I can sing it. Oh, say, can you see?" And so the class began singing. But it was something entirely strange and unknown to him. Instead of the rocket's red glare and the bombs bursting in air, they sang of a way that with tears has been watered, a path through the blood of the slaughtered. They were singing not the Star-Spangled Banner, which we might think of as the white national anthem, but Lift Every Voice and Sing, the black national anthem. Lift Every Voice and Sing is in our hymnal, and we've sung it together in the past. Maybe you remember it. I'm sorry we can't sing it together today. I want to close by reading some of its text to you. Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of our new day begun, let us march on till victory is won. Let us march on indeed. We are moving toward racial justice, but there is still much work to do. Let us keep up the fight. Those are some of my thoughts about racial justice today. What thoughts do you have? Let the congregational dialogue begin.